First and foremost, Canada, the most digitally connected commerce in the world. So that's the mission at Mastercard Canada. That's what we wake up thinking every morning. And I think the big question for me is, how do we make people's lives better? And how do we get there? So the conditions today are quite different than the conditions in the past. Global forces are shifting, and I think there's a few big players that were running a lot of digital commerce in the past, and now there are hordes of players. Business models are evolving worldwide, and frankly, Mastercard's not the same company today that we were 10 years ago. So, how are we going to move to this more digitally connected commerce? I want to challenge the room to think about the opportunity in front of us. So I think we have the chance to dramatically change the way consumers and businesses experience the digital economy. So I think let's start with a return to Canada. So one of the things that I learned being away for 10 years and coming back recently is Canadians are incredibly humble. So where do we stand in the world when it comes to payments? Frankly, we're leading the pack. So if we take a look at contactless, 30% of transactions in Canada are contactless today, and more importantly, if we take a look at year-over-year growth, we've grown by 50%. I love going to my North American meetings and listen to the team talk about EMV and chip. So as you all know, we're 100% card enabled, and we've been enabled that way for years. Our population is incredibly banked, just over 95%. We're incredibly well connected with the internet, and smartphone penetration is upwards of 85%. For us, Canada's second only to Singapore on something that we call mobile readiness. So I think we're very fortunate that we are where we are globally. All of this, I think, lays a great foundation for the future of innovations. I think the pace is what will be most crucial over the next 5 to 10 years. So if you'll indulge me, let me just take you on a field trip of sorts. I'd like to demonstrate how governments and private organizations have come together around the world to create the right conditions to allow some of these big ideas to come to fruition. So I spent 10 years in Europe, in Asia Pacific, and in Middle East Africa before coming back just a year and a half ago. And my role was focused on building partnerships to drive innovative change. So if you don't mind, let me take you to Egypt with our country manager, Magdi Hussein, who saw the challenges and saw within the challenges in Egypt a great opportunity. So basic infrastructure there. If you take a look at the merchant landscape of Egypt, 95% of them don't have access to electricity. So being able to hook up a POS terminal was going to be a real challenge. So the question was, how do we leapfrog some of these sort of infrastructure issues to build out almost a new way to think about payments? So what we did is we had to get together with the Egyptian government. We had to talk to the Egyptian bank company, EBC. And really what we decided to do is we started talking to the telcos. So back to Don's comment around inclusion and financial inclusion. Not surprisingly, in a country like Egypt, it has an incredibly small percentage of bank population, but as Don said, everyone's got a mobile phone. So 95% of Egyptians have a mobile phone. So we worked with the telcos, we then worked with some of the key financial players, and we worked with a really innovative merchant aggregator named Fowry. And it took quite a few meetings to remove personal agendas and personal game plans, and really, I think, brought together an incredibly new mobile payment ecosystem there. So the roles were incredibly clear. The biggest challenge was getting the economics right, and so those were articulated with different scenarios based on how it rolled out. Frankly, some of the thinking had to be an awful lot bigger than it had been in the past, and everyone understood that the first few years would require an awful lot of patience. And today, that mobile ecosystem that connects mobile phones to 16-digit card numbers is the plan and the future plan for payments in Egypt. Now, why don't we move to Sub-Saharan Africa? And no doubt many of you have heard about M-Pesa. So M-Pesa has set up an incredibly impressive mobile payment system themselves. I want to take you to Zimbabwe, where there's a payment setup called Ecocash. Ecocash, again, has brought together the telcos, the government, financial institutions. And what Ecocash was built with the government to do was to solve a big problem that M-Pesa had, which is 30% of the GDP was running through M-Pesa. And as many of you would know, that is an unfinancially regulated system. So there was grave concern what would happen if something ever happened to M-Pesa or happened to Vodacom. So that's what was built with Ecocash in Zimbabwe, very similar to Egypt, where telco numbers and telephones were linked into mobile payments. And going from just being able to do person to person, you were able to conduct commerce in a multitude of different ways. So today, Ecocash surpasses the transactions of all banking put together in the country of Zimbabwe. So let's move from developing countries, and let me just talk about a developed country we spent an awful lot of time working in, which is Sweden. And no doubt many of you know Sweden has long been a leader. They adopted payments in the 60s in order to look after wages. And they, not surprisingly, are a country that is now predicting going cashless in the next 15 years. So Bank ID, which was, I think, a really interesting innovation and collaboration. So it's an electronic ID system that was created together with the banks. It's got a digital version of your passport. It's got incredible commerce capabilities. Your driver's license fits in there. You pay your taxes with it. Frankly, you can even bet on soccer matches with it. So it's an incredible authentication system. It's also built in a digital signature service, which the EU has recognized as legally binding. 75% of the Swedish population uses it. So what's the downside? Well, blatantly, it displays your birth date. The first 6 digits of the number would be, for me, 680803. But that also talks to the transparency in building a system like this amongst all the parties. Again, Don sort of mentioned it very quickly around Secure Key with Verify Me. I think Canada's on the road to really tapping into something very similar to Bank ID. So, some different examples, but I think there's a similar formula underneath. So first, some really creative thinking, and something I really appreciate about having someone like Don get up is someone who's very disruptive. They're very disruptive in their thinking. They're bringing a very different lens to the way you're looking at solving a problem. Number 2 is checking organizational egos at the door. So I think especially in the Egypt example was the biggest issue. We had the Prime Minister come into the first meeting. We won't do that again. That probably wasn't the best idea because he had his own game plan. And I think after the first couple of months of people realizing that wasn't going to progress, the egos were parked. And probably the hardest is recognizing what's best for the individual organization in the short term is not necessarily the best for the long-term benefits of the country. And so keeping that thought in mind as we talk through some of those market solutions was absolutely critical. So I think the opportunities are endless here in Canada, and I think Jerry did a great job at setting that up. So what do we need to do? Well, I think one of the key things is we need to take a look at how do we take all the blocks that we currently have in play and how do we accelerate those? I think it also means where do we focus some of our attention? So in a truly digitally connected commerce, I believe there's sort of three areas that right now are coming to a fore in Canada. So the first one, not surprisingly, is consumers having access to being able to make payments, conduct commerce across devices, taking advantage of all the wonderful things that IoT will deliver for us. The second one is businesses and consumers being able to transact commerce globally in real time. And the third is smarter cities, which I believe will drive more convenience and ease for businesses and citizens. So let me touch on each of those areas. First, using a device using every device as a commerce device. I think that's a real national aspiration. I think what's at the heart of that right now in our evolution is the concept of wallets on the side of the consumer and ubiquitous acceptance. And I think the catchphrase is omni-channel on the merchant side. So for us, that simply means as we at Mastercard now start building out capabilities, we are thinking about them in a completely agnostic way, which must seem a little odd. It's odd for us, I must say, at the start. Right? So we're going to allow Visa cards into an electronic wallet. That doesn't sound like a good idea for us. But that makes a lot of sense for the consumer. And if we're thinking market-wide, that's what's going to happen. If we're going to put loyalty functionality into any of those types of wallet services, it's got to be functionality that not just works on a product that we may have our brand attached to, but that works on all products. The same on the acceptance side. If we want merchants to have an easier time adopting to the e-commerce space, we've got to create gateways that allow ubiquitous acceptance of all different types of brands and payment capability. So I think that's going to be critical on the consumer and business side. The second piece I mentioned was around real time. And this is probably a good time to talk about things like ACH and things that are very high on the Payments Canada radar right now. And I really believe this is going to be, I think, a way to really accelerate the overall payments growth in Canada. So not surprisingly, I'm assuming for all of you, ACH is half of all the spending in the top 50 countries in the world. And so if consumers are going to have the ultimate choice on how they spend, this is all going to need to find a wonderful way to be integrated. So I think the only way to do that will be, frankly, all of us finding an interesting way to work together with the right capabilities. David Yates is going to be up a little bit later to talk to you, who's the chairman of VocaLink. Mastercard recently purchased VocaLink, and frankly, it was with this in mind, this idea of all types of payment capability coming together and finding an easy way for consumers to ingest it, as well as for merchants. So we're excited about what I think VocaLink can do here in Canada, as they've done in the UK, the US, and now moving into Australia. And I think back to Don's comment around cross-border, I thought that was quite humorous, because that is a challenge in our space, and it's something that we need to tackle as people spend more money, move more money around the world. So third and finally, are cities growing more smartly? This is a fairly big passion of mine, because coming back, I'm a high user of our system, and there's probably some room for improvement. So So what's that look like? I think probably one of the areas to hit on is around data. So if we think about data and a smart city, I've now been on a bit of a talking circuit with the local government, so with Mr. Mayor Tory, with the provincial and with the national governments. And it's interesting, and I've now learned the hard way. I don't think government right now knows how to use data. And so by offering to them a service of let me help you with data, I realize they're actually looking for me to tell them with data what we can do. So why don't I take an example for you of some work that we did in Baltimore. I think it might sort of bring this to light. So Baltimore was having a real challenge better understanding the data around crime, commerce, and taxation. So we combined a bunch of the city stats with some of the transactional data that we have against two neighborhoods that were side by side. So one neighborhood had some spikes in crime, and not surprisingly, it resulted in restaurants and bars closing and a reduction in spending and an impact on taxes. The other had lower, it had some steady crime, but density of retail grew, and it was much more sustained spending in that neighborhood. What this helped the city do was it got them now thinking a little bit differently around policing, and it helped them figure out their transit footprint. We expanded that to other neighborhoods, and that really became a blueprint for how Baltimore was sort of tackling the urban expansion in their city. So I think that data piece is absolutely paramount for taking a look at a smarter city. The second piece is how people move around the city. If that's planning, it's movement. And so I'm thinking improving the lives of residents, probably not a bad segue into my ride on the TTC yesterday. So I think there's lots of opportunity around transit. Last week, some of you, I'm assuming, were at the Global Public Transit Summit, which took place in Montreal. Expert discussed lots of different aspects of transit, who's doing it well, where there's areas of opportunity, healthy discussion, I think. I think the team from our end took away a couple things. The biggest one, I think, was the movement to open loop transit. And again, if we just come back to that first premise I said around people being able to easily pay for things, I think the idea of open loop has been recognized in London, where no doubt most of you know Oyster's been replaced with open loop. So 40% of transactions now are open loop in London. Chicago's now moved to open loop, and New York is in a pilot testing that. So I think that's sort of where transit's going. And if we take a look again at sort of where those elements all come together, there's something now called sort of movement modulation, how people get from A to B. And again, if I think of being a citizen of Toronto, a Canadian citizen, that capability of being able to move around the city and conduct commerce seamlessly will make, I believe, my life an awful lot richer here. So, in closing, I think Canada's in a wonderful position right now from a digitally connected commerce space. I think if we realize the vision, my view is that being a Canadian citizen will become a much richer experience. I think connecting consumers, anyone, anyhow, anytime, anywhere, along with businesses being able to transact very comfortably and consumers transacting comfortably across borders in real time, and raising up our capabilities around smarter, sustainable cities will, I think, will make the big difference. So there'll be many of these, no doubt, explored over the next day or two. I look forward to hopefully creating and developing some of these payment innovations together. I'll be around the next few days, so please feel free to talk to me anytime. Thank you. Appreciate your time.